text. We're joined this afternoon by Karen Lowe. She is the director at 4 Day Week South Africa. Karen, great to talk to you. Thanks very much for coming onto the program. It's interesting, right? I'll get to how this impacts us here in South Africa. But it's interesting, this new legislation in Australia, it talks about the right to disconnect unless doing so is deemed unreasonable. That leaves a lot of room for grey area.
Doesn't it just? There's always grey area where operations are concerned and employee health on the other side. I think what we're dealing with here, though, is considering a basic human right. Michelle, I think we've allowed our work cultures and devices and technology to completely blur those lines between our professional and our personal lives, to the point at which we now need laws and legislation to change this behavior. You know, it's costing millions per health and well-being and all of those things. In Australia and the EU countries that have implemented this are the same as South Africa. I think they've just taken the first baby step in saying there needs to be better boundaries and there needs to be less of the blurring of lines between personal and work life. But there is a conflict.
Yeah. You're preaching to the choir. And if you do ignore, work calls, or if you complain that you're getting work calls and emails outside of your official working hours, you're probably going to be labeled as not being a team player.
100%. I mean, I just think in the South African context, we've got in many sectors, we've got this culture of overwork, busyness. And there's also that ingrained culture of if you're not there, you're not committed. If you're not prepared to take that call at 8 p.m. at night from your manager or your line manager or boss, that you're not sending the right message. I think people fear job loss. They fear a lack of showing the right level of commitment. They fear not being able to stay on top of their work. But I think overall, there's this guilt attached to not being responsive to this barrage of technology that comes at us. I mean, Michelle, literally, before I stopped onto this interview, I had to close my Slack channel, my WhatsApp channel, my email, my calendar, and my MS Teams, and silence my phone and my watch. Now, that's during working hours. You can just imagine that continuing after hours and then feeling compelled and needing to do it. And then the guilt attached to it, or worse, the fear of punitive measures, that what is the message that I'm sending if I am not always on and responsive to work?
Now, Karen, I thought that during COVID-19, I mean, you know, the importance of work-life balance was really at the fore, wasn't it? I mean, am I remembering this wrong? And this is why we started talking about the 4-day week, because companies were realizing that actually we don't need you to come in every single day. In fact, we don't even need offices. You can just work from home as long as you're meeting your deadlines and you're clocking those hours, whatever the case may be. You know, the work-life balance is the more important thing. That's what a pandemic will do to you. It'll make you reevaluate what's important. Am I getting that wrong?
No, you're not. I feel exactly the same way. But what happened was the advancements in technology didn't stop. So in other words, to harness the remote workforce that we were now forced to deal with as business owners, we used technology to ensure the operational efficiency and productivity and output stayed the same. But what we didn't do was put the boundaries in place for all of that new technology that we were using. So think of meetings, and we go from one meeting to the next without any breaks in between. Think of the proliferation of channels that we now have available to us as a result of the pandemic, which we are now using. And what's worse is we've enforced a back to work or back to the office culture, or in some instances, hybrid. So now you've got this behavioral practice where I'm always on because the technology is always on, and we haven't reconditioned ourselves into that work-life balance. Yep. It's just blurred completely.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you some context from a journalism perspective. I mean, stories break all the time, and there is no context in which you can ever switch off from being a journalist. So that's at the extreme level as well. But beyond that, the issue of bringing your gadgets home, you know, you were talking about having to turn off all of these various platforms before coming onto this interview. The issue of bringing your gadgets home, sometimes working from home, having your phone open, your emails not only on your laptop, but it's also on your phone. Maybe you're even getting alerts on your fitness watch. That's a huge one as well. Is that down to us? And the fact that we want to get our WhatsApps on our phones. We want to know who's texting us all the time.
We do. I think in some instances it's our dopamine hit, but in many instances it's also our cortisol feed. So, we are bombarded by these messages, and as you said, it is up to us as individuals to control it. But we also need, from a work perspective, a permissive corporate culture that enables or encourages that right to disconnect. Because I think the two go hand in hand. It's not so much a well-being program, for example, it's actually, are you practicing the art of being well? And there's a big difference between something that enables and then you taking ownership of the behavior that follows. So it's one thing as an employee setting a boundary and saying, you can't contact me after working hours unless, one, you pay me, or two, it's an absolute emergency. It's entirely another thing an employer saying, we actually encourage you and would like you not to please email other team members, ourselves, or anybody else, clients, etc., after working hours.
Right.
And I think if it becomes ingrained in the culture, it becomes more permissive, it becomes more acceptable, it's celebrated, it becomes more intentional, and therefore we internalize it as a practice. It's a bit like waking up in the morning and doing some journaling, or opening a meditation app, or making sure that you're tracking your walking. If it's part of your day-to-day life, and you feel that your work-life blending, because I don't like balance, I don't think we're able to achieve it. How do you blend work and life in a way that does not have an adverse effect on either? And I think that's what these laws are trying to do, is they're trying to bring into a sort of acute focus that we have toxic digital cultures, and they're ingrained in both organizational structures as well as in our personal space. And this is the first step in saying, let's create a new mindset to shift that. And make no mistake, Australia has a high level of employment. And I always say an employee market votes with their feet, right? If you're not doing things for me as an employee, I'm going to walk. In South Africa, we've got very high levels of unemployment, and we have an employer market. So we're fearing job losses, we're fearing the punitive measures. So unless the environment is enabling from a legislative perspective, no one's going to actually stand up and go, well, I'm going to go, sorry, you can't call me at 6 p.m. at night. Right. I'm with my kids. And equally so, I think the younger generation, which is our army of future youth coming through, hopefully they're going to do differently to what I did. And they're going to say, well, hang on a second, this is not right for my personal life. And you are an enabler to my lifestyle. You as an employer, give me my money. But I have a life after work. And I think we're going to see the consequences of the younger generation starting to participate more in making demands for better digital work cultures and better permissive cultures going forward.
Yeah, because the issue is, I might say, I received 2 emails last night at dinner, and that's fine. I'll reply to them. I'll address the issues in the email. But how do you bill for that? And also, how do you stop going from 2 emails to 10 emails, 20?
And I think this also is part of what we really work hard at the 4-day week, is what are you using culture for, and when is the right time to use that particular tool or technology. So in your instance as a journalist, if there's breaking news or you're preparing for your next show, there is a certain agreement that you have to check a particular type of technology, in your instance, email. Or if it's critical, I would imagine it would come through on some sort of alert, perhaps a broadcast WhatsApp channel, for example. But there is that sort of overcapacity that you haven't gotten to during the average work week that should not be brought home. And I think this is where employers and employees need to understand, just like they do when we start redesigning a work week, they need to understand that there are policies, frameworks, and guidelines that need to be put in place as a result of a discussion on what is acceptable and encouraged and what is not.
Right, it can't be unspoken.
And that's a valid point, Michelle.
Yeah.
What is everyone aware of? Because if the manager or the boss is sending an email and behaving badly at 8 o'clock at night, but she is the one that has actually mandated the right to disconnect. If the leaders aren't walking the talk, talking the talk and walking the walk, you can forget it.
Yeah.
It needs to be bottom up, top down, and agreed upon. And that's the only way systemic change is going to happen. But I do think you're right. It lies with us as individuals to understand at what point bringing work home and not disconnecting is harmful to our health, increasing our burnout and all of those mental health indicators as we are seeing in the workplace. And that is a direct result of poor digital habits that creep into the home environment.
So when we were talking about the 4-day work week, it was quite a big talking point. I think it was last year or the year before. We had Dion Chang in studio and he was piloting the 4-day work week in his company. And it's really sort of a social compact, right? You work 4 days a week where you perhaps come into the office. You'll maybe have, let's say, Friday, Saturday, Sunday off. And there's sort of an understanding, and these things are all set out on paper. Again, nothing is assumed. You're not going to take the Monday off as well, right? That's assumed. You're going to be at work on Monday. So there are all kinds of things that are outlined. We have to trust each other as employer and employee if this 4-day work week is going to work. Are companies now, and it does feel this way, that's fallen off the radar, the possibility of a 4-day work week. It's not so much something that is perhaps top of mind for companies. You are 4-day work week South Africa. Is that true?
I think there's a lot less publicity around it, but a lot more action on the ground.
Okay.
So we're actually looking at running some sector trials within the student counselling space. So one of the trial participants from the second cohort in South Africa, and this hasn't been heavily publicised, is actually Stellenbosch University, their student centre for counselling and development. And Charles Davids, the director there, was very brave to do this initiative in his student centre. So we're talking 60-odd social workers, psychologists and counsellors that support the student body at Stellenbosch University. The business cases are now starting to emerge. So on the one hand, you've got the human story of the well-being, the drop in burnout, reduction in anxiety, sick leave, absenteeism, all of the rest of it. But one of the most remarkable things about these kind of case studies that I'm now dealing with organizations on a one-on-one basis is that real hardcore business case. So one of the things that Stellenbosch needed to do was to ensure that they did not affect the student wait time to be able to access counselling services. And what happened at the end of the 4-day week trial, when we went back over the data, is they've actually improved student wait time from an average of 3 months to 2 to 3 weeks. So if you were a student in need of counselling services right now, as a result of the 4-day week, you would be able to access a psychologist within 2 weeks for whatever you were dealing with. And that sounds completely counterintuitive because that was with a 32-hour work that was reduced time. So organizations are doing it globally. And I think Namibia is trialing. They've just come online. And internationally, the entire European Union is switching on and in various stages of recruitment at the moment. So there's more to come. I'm pretty sure, Michelle, I'll be in your newsroom soon enough again telling you more about the 4-day week because it's by no means a fight I'm willing to give up.